Now, to talk about our guest of honor this morning, Mr. Sanjay Baru, sir, Dr. Sanjay Baru sir. Sanjay Baru sir is a senior journalist who worked as chief editor of Business Standard. He also worked in higher positions in Economic Times and Times of India. He was media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh from 2004 to 2008. He was also the chief spokesperson of PMO office. He was director at the Institute of Strategic Studies in charge of geoeconomics and strategy. He served as Secretary General of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry till 2018. He writes a column of Delhi Darbar, a civil society magazine. Sanjay Baru sir's father, BPR Vittal, was a famous official who worked in Hyderabad and Delhi. He was finance secretary. Sanjay Baru sir, who studied at Jawaharlal Nehru University, taught at Hyderabad Central University for some time. He wrote a very important book, The Accidental Prime Minister, The Making and Unmaking of Manmohan Singh. He also wrote 1991 How P.V. Narasimha Rao sir made history. He also published India's Power Allied, a film by the name The Accidental Prime Minister was released in January 2019. I am sure that you all have seen the movie, and Akshay Khanna played Sanjay Baru in the film. It was a lovely movie, so now I would request you all to please give a round of applause as I call Dr. Sanjay Baru sir.
You know, one of my duties as media advisor to the Prime Minister was to remove the cameramen and photographers from line of vision of the audience. So may I request you, after 15 years I'm doing the same job now, please move your cameras to the left, or you please sit down. Please. This used to be my role. I used to tell Dr. Manmohan Singh that, sir, television is important, and he would say, no, my audience is in front of me. I don't care for those who are not in front of me. But we are today in a world where Prime Minister's audience are all over the place. And the Prime Minister has become an expert in posing for TV cameras. But I am not yet Prime Minister, so I don't mind if the TV cameras are even off. My audience is in my room. So thank you very much. Prabhakar Garu, dignitaries on the dais, dignitaries in the audience, Ponal Garu, etc. Let me first begin by saying that I share entirely the sentiments of the two speakers who spoke before me about our late Prime Minister. As Prabhakar knows very well, I have repeatedly written in many of my columns that it is a shame that Prime Minister Narasimha Rao has not been given a Bharat Ratna. If you look at the kind of characters that have been given Bharat Ratna, K.RamachandraMurthy was given a Bharat Ratna. And if you look at the contribution, as has just been explained, the historic contribution of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, there is no one more deserving of Bharat Ratna today than him. And it's one of my lasting regrets that in his 10 years of Prime Ministership, Dr. Manmohan Singh was unable to do this. I have no answer as to why he did not do it. But those of you who know the politics of the Congress Party might know. The Congress Party, it's a shame that the Congress Party did not give Prime Minister Narasimha Rao Bharat Ratna. And the BJP can today say, well, they didn't give it, so why should we give it? But I think he certainly laid the foundations, as has already been explained in great detail, for so many fronts, not just economic reforms for which he is known, but education, foreign policy, so many years. I will take about 30-35 minutes, so those of you who are getting hungry for your lunch should know that I will not take more than 30 minutes. I'm grateful to the PV Global Foundation for inviting me to deliver the PV Narasimha Rao Memorial Lecture. I feel honored particularly because of the many distinguished people who have spoken here before me, beginning with Pranab Babu and most recently my former colleague and political science professor Chandrasekhar Rao, for whom I have great regard. While he did not have the opportunity, while Prime Minister Narasimha Rao did not have the opportunity to leave his imprint on this city, he brought the city itself into global focus, leaving his imprint on the country as a whole. As I had said over a decade ago in the Wahiduddin Khan Memorial Lecture that I delivered at the Center for Economic and Social Studies, in the medieval times, Golconda and Hyderabad were global centers with trading links to the Far East and Mediterranean. This city has once again become a global city with links to the rest of the world, thanks to a range of businesses and institutions that are now housed here. This second globalization of Hyderabad, as I call it, occurred after the 1990s due to the new opportunities opened up for local and regional enterprise by the policies that we associate with Prime Minister Rao. Of course, we should give equal credit to several chief ministers like Sri Vengal Rao, Sri Chandrababu Naidu, Sri Y.S. Rajshekar Reddy and Sri K. Chandrasekhar Rao. However, the new worldview that all of them came to represent for this city of Hyderabad, which has contributed to its development, was crafted within a policy paradigm that we now associate with Prime Minister Rao. In my book 1991, How Narasimha Rao Made History, I said, and I quote, "The initiatives that he took within a year of assuming office have since defined the post-Nehruvian era in India. The policy shift on the economic front was the more obvious of the changes and the one that received the most academic attention. Less appreciated have been the shifts on the foreign policy front, both within Asia and around the world, and the interrelationship between the two. Finally, there was the new turn on the political front with the era of single-party dominance giving way to an era of what V.P. Singh called an era of coalitions. Many political scientists have written about this era of coalitions, as V.P. Singh famously dubbed it. It lasted longer than what V.P. Singh assumed. From 1989 to 2014, India lived in an era of coalitions. While both the Prime Ministers V.P. Singh and Chandrasekhar failed to manage their minority governments and therefore had short-lived tenures, it was PV who demonstrated the political skills necessary to not merely manage a coalition, which indeed the Congress party itself was, but in fact utilized the opportunity provided by his unexpected tenure to undertake significant policy changes. Some may argue that Prime Minister Rao was not the head of a coalition in the manner in which his four successors, Deve Gowda, Gujral, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh were. This would be a simplistic way of understanding the nature of Congress party politics. The Congress was always a coalition. PV was the first non-Nehru Gandhi to be given the responsibility of managing this coalition. Indeed, even more than that, his was a minority government, and so he had to also neutralize opposition political parties and win their support to be able to undertake far-reaching changes in Indian economic and foreign policy. So it is safe to say that India lived in an era of coalition for almost 25 years. In my lecture today, I will examine whether this era of coalitions, rather than the era of single-party dominance, especially the authoritarian system of top-down governance that we witnessed during the emergency years of Indira Gandhi and that we now experience under the Prime Ministership of Narendra Modi, has produced better policies and better results or not. I shall submit for your consideration the idea that the era of coalitions was in fact the golden era for the Indian economy. And there are good reasons rooted in the political economy of our democracy that explain this. The most important factor is the manner in which Prime Minister Rao combined his post-Nehruvian new economic policy with what may be called the Nehruvian policy of consensual politics. While moving away from Nehru's mixed economy model, he returned to Nehru's political middle path. Both the economic policy initiative and its political management were dictated by necessity and circumstance rather than matters of choice. In doing what was needed on the economic front, Prime Minister Rao had no option but to take as many as he could along with him, rather than dictate policy from above. But the latter option of dictating from above was simply not available to him, given the weakness of his political support base. Let us first consider the facts. It is now well known that the average annual rate of growth of the Indian economy from 1950 to 1980 was 3.5%, while for the period 1980 to 2000 it was 5.5%, and from 2000 to 2015 it was 7.5%. This is the rising India curve: 3.5, 5.5, 7.5. Since 2015, the economy has slowed down. And right now we are in a phase where the rate of growth is likely to be around 5 to 6% and not the 7% headline you saw this morning. I don't think we'll ever get to 7 in the next couple of years. Since 2015, there has been a deceleration in economic growth, with average for the period 2014 to 23, excluding the COVID-19 year of negative growth, estimated to be around 6%. In short, in simple terms of overall economic growth, the best years for the Indian economy were 2000 to 2015, which I call the golden years of growth, during which period two explicit coalitions, one led by Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and another led by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, were in office. The decade during which the turn in economic performance occurred was, however, the 1990s, when Prime Minister Rao was in office. A further disaggregation of the growth data throws up an even more interesting political economy result. Some may point to the Nehru years, especially the decade of the 1950s, as contradicting our hypothesis that the economy performed better during coalition era than during single-party dominance. On the contrary, the Nehru decade does not invalidate our hypothesis for two reasons. First, the Indian National Congress, as I've already said, particularly during Prime Minister Nehru's tenure, functioned like a coalition. The political scientist Rajni Kothari called it the Congress system, when the party was an umbrella under which many diverse interests found shelter. The Congress, wrote Professor Kothari, was a party of consensus. Nehru's greatest contribution to nation building was not in that he started a revolution, but that he gave rise to a consensus. Unquote. A second and equally important factor was that even with a towering personality like Nehru as Prime Minister, the Congress party not only had equally tall leaders in the Union Council of Ministers, but also state chief ministers of national stature and consequence, enjoying independent political authority. When I talk to young people these days, they don't even understand this, because they think that the Nehruvian period was like the emergency period, or like the Modi era, one strong prime minister, which is simply not true. You had people like Sanjeev Reddy, Brahmanand Reddy here in Andhra Pradesh, you had Mohanlal Sukadia, you had Bahuguna, you had Atulya Ghosh, you had Nijalingappa, you have in the opposition EMS, Namboodiripad, Anna Durai, the most powerful chief ministers. It was an era of powerful prime minister, but powerful union ministers and powerful chief ministers, Y.B. Chavan and so on and so forth. As Prime Minister, Nehru had to manage both his colleagues and his chief ministers. And now there is a lot of literature showing Nehru's personal correspondence with chief ministers, how he related to them, how he respected chief ministers and communicated policy with them. Something we rarely hear of these days. It is also useful to remember that the growth rate India logged in the 1950s of around 4% signaled a significant achievement because the half a century before that, from 1890 to 1940, British India managed to record barely an annual average rate of growth of 0.7% for 50 years. So in fact, till the foreign exchange crisis of 58 and the China War of 62, India was one of the best performing economies in the world. The Indira Gandhi years can be divided into two parts. First, the period from mid-60s till 78, and second, the 1980s. By 69, Indira Gandhi acquired dominance over her party and enjoyed unparalleled power till the end of the emergency. These, however, were the worst years for the economy. So you had a powerful prime minister, but an economy that underperformed. The three wars of 62, 65 and 71 and the drought years of 65, 67 had deleterious effects on the economy. One consequence of what I call the decade of crisis was the slowing down of overall economic growth. After recording an average annual rate of growth of 4% in 51-65, the growth slowed down in 65-80 to 3.2%. Most of this slowdown occurred during the second half of the 60s and the 70s, which are essentially the Indira Gandhi years. Indira Gandhi acquired her dominance over her party through a variety of means, including making the best use of an opportunity provided by the military dictatorship in Pakistan that enabled her to aid the liberation of Bangladesh. On the political front, her decisive strategy was to turn to the left, undertaking nationalization of a range of economic activity, increasing the ambit of bureaucratic socialism through a pervasive license permit control Raj, and imposing draconian controls during the emergency. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi acquired enormous power and centralized it in the Prime Minister's office. It was an era in which chief ministers were reduced to rubber stamps, as we ourselves saw in Hyderabad. The balance in center-state relations was shifted decisively in favor of the center. Junior staff of the Prime Minister's office were issuing orders to ministers. What was the net impact of such centralization of power, of increasing bureaucratic control over business and the markets? The 1970s delivered the lowest rate of economic growth and the highest rates of inflation. Unemployment raised its head with major trade union action across the country. In fact, the railway workers' strike of 1974 became one of the triggers for the imposition of the emergency. The Economist magazine described Indira Gandhi as the Empress of India after she liberated Bangladesh. Yet this Empress could not deliver development. The economic slogan of that decade that Indira Gandhi came to be identified with was Garibi Hatao, drawing attention to the failure of 3 decades of post-independence development in eliminating mass poverty. Having learned lessons from this experience, a chastened Indira returned to power in 1980 and changed both her economic policies and her style of functioning. While the earlier imperial approach was seen in her government's treatment of the NTR chief ministership and the attempt to dismiss the NTR government, she quickly retreated, allowing reinstatement of NTR and appointed the Justice Sarkaria Commission on Center-State Relations, which made far-reaching recommendations for empowerment of states. A more liberal and democratic style of functioning in the 1980s by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and her son Rajiv Gandhi had a positive impact on India's political economy. Yet, despite having an unprecedented majority in Parliament, with over 400 MPs on the side of the Treasury benches, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was unable to take decisive steps to accelerate the pace of growth of the economy. Recall the fact that till 1980, India and China moved more or less at the same pace, even if China was marginally ahead of India. In 1980, China's GDP was just about $400 billion and India's was close to $300 billion, difference of only $100 billion. By 1990, China's GDP was twice as big as India's, exceeding $1 trillion, while India's was still less than 500 billion. The 90s was the decade in which China began to take off, while India began moving forward under the leadership of Prime Minister Rao. China's economic reforms began in 1979 and India's began in 1991. That 12-year gap made all the difference for securing China's geo-economic advantage over India. Yet it is relevant to note that the 1990s was the decade of change. The industrial policy liberalization that Prime Minister Rao personally spearheaded, doubling up as the cabinet minister in charge of industry, enabled a structural change in the manufacturing sector. From 1960 to 1990, for 3 decades, there was hardly any change in the composition of the ownership of the top 100 private sector companies. The same names appeared decade after decade. Tata, Birla, Modi's, Goenkas, Singhanias, Thapars, Shriram's, Godrej. The composition of Indian business hardly changed. All of a sudden, the 1990s witnessed the emergence of new business groups among the top 100. The Ambanis were the first to enter this league, followed by the Munjals, the Mittals, the Mahindras, the TVS Group, Premji, Infosys, and so on. PV took care to ensure that even as his policies unleashed the so-called animal spirits of enterprise and encouraged entrepreneurship, they took care to balance this with support for the less privileged sections of society. This strategy, which came to be known as reforms with a human face, he conceptualized this in his very famous and historic address to the All India Congress Committee in Tirupati in April 1992. Incidentally, when I published my book 1991, I tried to get hold of this speech. It was not available on the Congress Party website. It was not available in the Congress Party records. I found a typed copy of it with my father, which because he helped the Prime Minister Rao in writing that speech. So he had in his papers a typed copy, which I have actually photographed and reproduced. So if you look at my book 1991, the appendix is the text of that speech, which is the only place now where you can actually get hold of that address. But it's a historic address of Prime Minister Rao as President of the AICC. And I quote him. There is, however, one danger which we must all guard against in the opening up process. He's talking about economic reforms. This could lead to wider disparities within society. To meet this situation, we have to enable the underprivileged sections to also derive benefit from the new economic opportunities. This process would naturally need some time to fructify. Until that happens, there has to be a bypass arrangement whereby benefits reach the lowest rung of social pyramid directly from the state. And I continue to quote Mr. Rao. Influenced by the great Buddha, Jawaharlal Nehru tried to mark what may be called a middle way for us in all our spheres of activity. It was the same in non-alignment in international relations or in his concept of mixed economy with a socialistic pattern of society. To interpret Nehru's middle way as being valid only in a bipolar situation is not to understand our ancient philosophy of the middle way. The middle way was meant to be a constant reminder that no assertion or its opposite can be the full and complete truth. It meant that we look for truth in the interstices of dogma. It means today that we will accept no dogma, even if it happens to be the only dogma remaining in the field. Our quest for truth must continue. Unquote. In setting out these references, Prime Minister Rao defined what I call a new political economy of growth. Incidentally, I should mention here, I was lecturing the other day at the Kautilya school, and I suddenly remembered that, what Prime Minister Rao calls the middle way, the middle path. Many, many years later, when Tony Blair became Prime Minister of Britain, a professor at the London School of Economics became very famous because he had written a book titled The Middle Way. And Tony Blair said in one speech that this is my Bible. And then all kinds of editorials were being written, all kinds of articles were being written about the middle way. And then I had to remind people that the original author of the concept was Narasimha Rao, and long before Tony Blair and this professor at the London School of Economics. In setting out these reference points, Prime Minister Rao defined a new political economy of growth, one that allowed domestic enterprise to grow, liberating it from the shackles of the bureaucratic statism, even as the challenge of inequality was addressed directly. He made it a point to remind business journalists that he was not merely freeing private enterprise, but also spending more funds on social welfare, funding an employment guarantee program, and a food subsidy scheme. What is now known as the NREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the original author of that was Prime Minister Rao. When the managing director of the International Monetary Fund at that time, Michel Kamdasu, called on Prime Minister Rao, the Prime Minister told him very categorically, "I will do whatever is required to promote growth and enterprise, but nothing that I do should make even one worker unemployed." This is such an important assertion coming from a Prime Minister, and particularly at a time today when the rate of unemployment is the highest in the country over the last 50 years. This was the version of reforms with a human face. It is not surprising that during the period 1995 to 2015, India not only experienced the highest rates of economic growth, but also witnessed a sharp rise in employment and a sharp fall in poverty. All the data is available. This growth process also spread out regionally, with new centers of manufacturing appearing in peninsular India and new business groups establishing themselves in these regions. For a century, the growth process in the subcontinent was regionally confined to western and southern coastal regions. Thanks to the Green Revolution, the benefits of growth spread inland to agrarian regions in the Punjab, Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. By adopting a lighter touch in center-state relations, pursuing a path of genuine cooperative federalism, both Prime Minister Rao and Prime Minister Vajpayee helped states spread the process of development to new regions. The Union government worked with state governments with different political parties in office. Let us not forget the kind of relationship, for example, that Prime Minister Vajpayee had with Chandrababu Naidu, though there were two different political parties. The Union government worked with state governments with different political parties in office. Federalism and federal institutions received a boost that made the growth process more regionally inclusive. In short, the new transformative political economy of Prime Minister Rao witnessed the base of economic growth, widened the base of economic growth and development. Not surprisingly, his successor, Prime Minister Vajpayee, walked the same path, the same middle way as PV. Though Vajpayee came from an ideologically oriented party whose core agenda was viewed as divisive and majoritarian, Prime Minister Vajpayee chose to pursue an inclusive approach to social and economic issues. Both Prime Minister Rao and Prime Minister Vajpayee were two sides of the same coin of consensual political leadership. The 1990s was the decade when economic institutions began measuring the size of the Indian middle class. India's big business, that was still the 1970s, focused only on metropolitan Indian market, began to discover emerging domestic markets for manufactured goods in new urban centers and semi-urban areas. The rural demand for manufactures generated by the Green Revolution sustained a new bout of manufacturing activity through the 80s and 90s. In the realm of foreign policy too, and that has been mentioned by both the speakers before me, Prime Minister Rao took many significant initiatives, responding to the new global context arising out of the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the United States as the sole superpower. Each of the initiatives he took, the outreach to the United States, his Look East policy, the diplomatic recognition of Israel, the establishment of closer economic relations with the European Union and Japan, are all policies that all subsequent governments have pursued. In dealing with prickly issues like Kashmir, he reached out to the opposition political leadership. It may be recalled that in 1994, as Prime Minister, he requested the leader of the opposition, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, to head an official Indian delegation to the UN Human Rights Conference in Geneva to defend India's record in Kashmir. The delegation included the then Minister of State for External Affairs, Salman Khurshid, the Kashmir leader, Farooq Abdullah, and Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh. Look at the wisdom and courage of a Prime Minister who brings together Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Farooq Abdullah, Manmohan Singh, and Salman Khurshid, and sends them to Geneva to defend India's record in Kashmir. That is how he united this country. Each of these instances are examples of an inclusive style of politics that Prime Minister Rao and his two successors, Prime Minister Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh, emulated. The ultimate recognition of the importance of this politics of consensus lay in the fact that as Prime Minister, Mr. Vajpayee continued every initiative that Prime Minister Rao took in his tenure. Many neoliberal economists have criticized Prime Minister Rao for what they viewed as half-hearted liberalization. Reacting to his enunciation of the concept of the middle path at AICC session in Tirupati, a senior cabinet minister at that time said to me in jest, "I hope the middle path does not end up as a muddle path." Was it that PV was half-hearted in his pursuit of economic reform and liberalization? Or was it that he was politically cautious? I believe it is his cautious and consensual approach that in fact ensured that his initiatives endured his government. Both he and his two successors had to battle both internal party opposition as well as opposition political parties. Rather than halt them in their tracks, the experience of dealing with such opposition made them reach out to critics and widen the constituency for change. If Prime Minister Rao adopted a consensual path because of the internal dynamics of the Congress party, Prime Ministers Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh adopted a similar approach because they were leading a coalition government and had to perforce take all allies with them. Of course, it is a fact that even they had to deal with political rivals and rival political centers even within their own party. Many have often viewed this as a handicap, as a shortcoming, as a constraint. Rather, I argue, the political situation they found themselves in forced Prime Ministers Rao, Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh to think long-term, to build alliances, to secure support from rivals, to move forward in a manner that enabled their policy initiatives to outlast their respective tenures. There is much wisdom in the saying, act in haste and repent at leisure. We have seen how powerful Prime Ministers like Indira Gandhi and Narendra Modi have often acted in haste and have had to repent at leisure. Indira Gandhi's handling of Sikh militancy, Rajiv Gandhi's handling of Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and Prime Minister Modi's recent handling of the farm agitation, or even of demonetization, are examples of acting in haste and repenting at leisure. It is their political unassailability that makes them take tough decisions without thinking through. If Prime Minister Vajpayee and Prime Minister Rao deployed their consensual style in undertaking far-reaching economic policy reforms that put India on a new growth trajectory of 7.5% per annum, Manmohan Singh used similar tactics to secure success for his important foreign policy initiative, the US-India nuclear deal. In the end, the opposition to his initiative was reduced to an essentially desperate political attempt to unseat the government. However, where Dr. Singh succeeded was in carrying all sections of the policy establishment and his own party along with him. Significant and fundamental shifts in policy have come both through top-down commands as well as through consensus building. It is the consensually arrived at policies that have endured longer and have been more readily accepted by a wider cross-section of society. The economic consequences of this consensual approach of policy making are before us. the golden years of growth from late 1990s to the mid-2010s, when investment increased, share of manufacturing and national income increased, India's share of world trade increased, foreign exchange remittances increased, foreign exchange reserves increased, employment increased, and poverty decreased. You look at all the numbers, all the positives go up and poverty decreased. These were the golden years for the Indian economy. And the policies of this period were crafted by these three prime ministers. India's rise was welcomed by a world that celebrated its pluralism, its liberalism, its multi-religious multiculturalism, its unity in diversity. India's rise was not welcomed merely as a counter to China. India was not viewed as a pawn in any great game. Rather, as President Bush explained to his wife Laura Bush when they first met Manmohan Singh, this was in the summer of 2005 in Moscow on Kremlin, on the wall. When they first met, Bush said to Laura Bush, George Bush said to his wife, "This is the Prime Minister of India. He is a Sikh, his president is Muslim, his party president is Christian, but India is a Hindu majority country. India is a liberal democracy." That is how George Bush introduced Manmohan Singh to his wife. It made us all who are there feel so proud to be Indian. P.V. Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh strengthened the foundations of our nationhood and enabled the economy to rise. It is India's pluralism, liberalism, secularism and democratic values that the world has come to value. But these are attributes that we must value ourselves, for our nationhood is built on these foundations. If we shake these foundations, we destroy ourselves. The politics and economics of authoritarianism have weakened India before and they weaken India again. They diminished India in the past and will diminish us in the future. It is inclusive politics of the kind that Prime Minister Rao pursued through what he called his middle way that we must rediscover today for a better tomorrow. Thank you.